Hi, I'd like to welcome everyone to another episode of Better Without Pills. I feel really honored to have the guest who's going to join us today for our discussion, Michelle Hurn, who is a registered dietitian. Michelle, maybe you could tell our people a little about yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on. Yeah, I am a registered dietitian. My health journey really began when I was 12 years old. I was diagnosed with anorexia nervosa, a very serious eating disorder. I was about 5 feet tall and 57 pounds. So I went through the inpatient hospitalization where I was fed the standard American diet and put on a 24-hour tube feeding system. And for people who aren't familiar with the ingredients of tube feeding formulas, they're back then, which was, more than 20 years ago, they're the same as they are today. The number one ingredients are sugar, corn syrup, high fructose corn syrup, soy protein, and canola oil. And I did become weight restored. I was put on 7 different medications because I was having severe GI issues, depression, anxiety. And I was just told I was going to have to become a very high functioning person with an eating disorder. I was told I would always struggle with racing thoughts around food. I would always struggle with wanting to restrict, and that was true. I found that was true for most of my life. I struggled quite a bit. And when as I got older, I decided I wanted to become a dietitian because food had saved my life. I became weight restored. And I just had this feeling that I was missing something. Like, was there a way that I could heal my body or heal my brain? And when I became a traditional dietitian, unfortunately, the traditional dietetic school really teaches us that every disease state, no matter if you have type 2 diabetes, if you have kidney failure, if you've been in a traumatic accident, trying to gain weight, lose weight, the foundation of human nutrition is carbohydrates. So throughout my dietetic internship, I would just ask questions like, does it really make sense to give somebody with type 2 diabetes, carbohydrates throughout the day and dose them with insulin? Wouldn't it make more sense to just reduce their carbohydrates? And I was kind of pegged as this difficult dietetic student. I'll never forget going into the ICU and looking at tube feeding formulas. And I was like, oh my God, this is the same thing I was fed as a 12-year-old. And this was, literally almost 12 years later. And now it's, 2 decades later, and it's still the same thing, and I would just, like I said, I would ask questions. Is this the best way to feed people, right?
Yeah, you think critically ill people that they would be very cautious about what they're giving them, but instead it's still whether feeding the inflammation, feeding the
exactly. Well, and that's what happens when you're taught that it's all about calories, right? I was taught it's all about calories and getting protein. The source is irrelevant. You can get it from sugar, you can get it from fruit, it doesn't matter. And that's where we came obviously to a big problem. And when I became a dietitian, I was also became a competitive athlete. I became a runner. And I've done 13 marathons. But unfortunately, throughout my career as a dietitian, my patients weren't really getting much better. We'd call them frequent flyers in the acute care. You'd see someone with prediabetes would come back with type 2 diabetes months later with an infection, with abscesses, having to do amputations. And I was just told, like, hey, look, it's not the guidelines. It's not that you're doing anything wrong. It's just our patients aren't complying. Our patients aren't doing what we tell them to do. And for the most part, I found that really not to be true. Most patients were really trying to, eat the healthy whole grains and eat low fats, and they were just struggling. They were hungry. They'd get motivated for a while and follow the guidelines, but then kind of go off and eat whatever. But it wasn't really until I had my own health crisis in 2019 that I completely shifted how I ate. And that is what led me down this, low carb journey and really turned my life around.
Maybe you can touch on, there are certain, I guess they would call them truths or things we've learned all our life regarding issues like cholesterol, red meat, vegetables, fruit, fiber. So if you were discussing a low carb diet, which may entail increasing red meat, and someone were to raise their concern about cholesterol, how might you respond to that concern?
Yeah, right. Because we've been told through educate, all of our education. I mean, if you ask anybody and said, like, what's good for you? Everybody thinks fruits and vegetables are good for everybody. And everybody, not everybody, but a lot of people would say you need to keep your red meat low. Red meat is high in saturated fat, and saturated fat is bad for your heart, And the problem with that is we really looked at saturated fat and red meats through a vacuum. And, and we could talk for hours about this, but kind of briefly, the issue is when you do consume a lot of saturated fat and animal fats, you can raise your LDL cholesterol. And what people have come to think, once again, looking in a vacuum, is okay, we actually, if you look in an occluded artery, if you look in an artery that's clogged, you'll actually find LDL. And so what they thought was like, okay, LDL, high LDL, we see LDL in arteries, so high LDL must equal heart disease. What they didn't ask is like, why? Why are we seeing LDL? Why are we seeing arteries clogged? Because we know throughout evolution and throughout history, people ate only meat and fat, right? We know they ate the megafauna. They killed these large animals and they treasured the fat. The fat is where all the calories were and where a lot of that fat soluble nutrition, vitamin D, E, A, and K are fat soluble vitamins, meaning you have to have fat in order to absorb them correctly. And so, as opposed, they said one thing equals another, as opposed to, asking the deeper question, why? Because we even have like studies like the Inuit Eskimos, right? Like their diet is 80 to 90% fat, and they have zero heart disease. So what's going on, right? And LDL is so important. It's gotten this like really bad reputation, but it's crucial in the immune system. We actually have lots of studies that people, especially elderly people that have higher LDL, live longer because it's a critical part of your immune system. So once again, going back to your original question, like, okay, Michelle, I ate all this red meat, my LDL goes up. Is that going to clog my arteries? The question, the answer is it depends. Something else has to happen in the artery for the LDL to get stuck. You have to have some type of inflammation or oxidation. If not, LDL is just flowing through. It's just doing its job. It's a very important lipoprotein. It has many functions in the body. So the question that most medical and dietetic professionals aren't asking is, okay, what causes LDL to get stuck in your arteries? And the number one cause of inflammation and oxidation is hyperglycemia over time, meaning high blood sugar. So that's why diabetics, type 2 diabetics, have a really high 2 to 4-fold risk of getting heart disease, is because they're damaging their arteries by having that really high blood sugar over time. Then the LDL gets stuck. If you're just eating meat and saturated fat and consuming a low carbohydrate diet, you're going to have very healthy arteries, and LDL will flow through freely like it's supposed to.
And vegetables, which we hear, of course, can be an important part of your diet, have some positive attributes, but it is a double-edged sword. Can you maybe, any reservations you have about vegetables?
Yeah, it's funny, right? Because like I said earlier, if you just ask anybody on the street, what's the healthiest food? Most people would say vegetables. And when I was a dietitian, people were always saying like, oh yeah, I really try to eat vegetables. Like it seems to be universally accepted that vegetables are good for you, good for everybody, good for all disease states. But here's the problem, and here's the issue. A lot of vegetables, I like to say this, like if you and I were to go hunting, let's say we're hunting deer, and I step on a stick and the deer hears it, it's taken off, the deer's out of there. Like nothing wants to be on the menu for lunch, but vegetables are rooted to the ground. They literally cannot move. So over time, their defense mechanism to avoid being eaten by predators is they produce a lot of toxins. They produce a lot of things that can have negative effects in the human body. And some of those, for example, are like oxalates. Spinach is very high in oxalates or oxalic acid. We know if you consume too much of that, you can get kidney stones. What's another good example? Phytic acid. Phytic acid is in seeds and grains. Phytic acid actually binds to iron too. That's a huge problem. Where iron is the #1 mineral deficiency worldwide. And it's like, people aren't eating liver and these things high in iron. They're eating all this phytic acid. But back to vegetables. So certainly specific vegetables like the chards, the kales, things like that we've been told are so good for us can actually be causing damage in our body, which seems like heresy to say. And of course, like vegetables like the nightshades, potatoes, tomatoes, eggplants, those things can be very inflammatory to the human body. They can actually be, if somebody eats them, they can be recognized as a foreign invader, and they can cause rashes, they can cause inflammation in your joints. And once again, this isn't, people don't email me. This isn't saying that all vegetables are bad or all plant products. I'm not anti-plant or anti-carbohydrate, But depending on what your health is, I think it's a good place to start. Do I need to be including all these vegetables? And I'll say a final thing about that is often when people think they should be losing weight or dieting, they tend to have these big, massive salads. So they're eating all this fiber, and an hour later, they've got gas, they feel bloated and gross, and they're hungry. So in my opinion, plant material in general, specifically vegetables, should be a small part of the overall human diet.
Yeah, I do have concern also mechanically as the vegetables go through the intestines, the colon, that they have potential to be a mechanical stress, and there can be increased permeability. Things go cross from the intestine into your body, and whether that is triggering inflammatory responses. Part of my um, reason for having this channel of Better Without Pills is that I will see patients who appear to be inflamed, but whether it's their list of medical problems, whether it's their list of complaints, joint problems, skin rash, um, other issues, and sometimes a list of diagnoses from endometriosis to interstitial cystitis, which is an inflammation of the bladder. And often people have these lists that I'll see over again, and they've been through the regular medical approach. I've been tried on various pills, and maybe on a list of 10 pills, and still not feeling well. And one of the things, jumping ahead to your book, which we'll talk a little bit more, was you had some wonderful testimonials from people with various issues that making adjustments in their diets had a significant effect. Let me just touch on a couple of things. I mean, you mentioned fiber. I mean, which again, we've always been taught fiber is a really important, wonderful thing. Are there other sides to that coin?
Yeah, we really don't have good studies that fiber actually prevents constipation, helps with constipation, actually produces, easy, pain-free bowel movements. Often people who have fiber, it's the opposite. They get hard, impacted stools. Fiber, just kind of like phytic acid, also it forms covalent bonds with minerals. It actually binds to iron, zinc, and calcium. So things that our population doesn't tend to eat eat those things in its bioavailable forms. So now we're eating, the iron that we do eat is actually being bound to fiber, and our body isn't able to utilize and absorb that well. So, and it's funny because if you look at, goofy cereal boxes will say like, oh, good source of fiber lowers LDL. Well, like I stated at the beginning of this, LDL is very important in the human body. It actually has so many functions, including improving your immune system. Do we want to lower something that's improving our immune system? No, in the context of a terrible standard American diet, that's a whole nother story. But if you're trying to be a healthy person, and like you said, fiber can cause a lot of inflammation. If your system is already inflamed, if you already have, like you said, any kind of itis, gastritis, there's so many different ones. Yeah, then it's like fiber's like a scrub brush. You would never take one of those silver scrub brushes and, like, let's say you had an open wound on your arm and just like go back and forth. That would be crazy. But that's what we do to our intestinal system when it's already irritated and inflamed when we consume a lot of fiber.
And one other issue, salt, is something, again, we've always been told, be so cautious about salt. What might you comment about the importance of salt?
Yeah, salt is, when it comes to sugar and salt, we got one wrong. One wrong, right? I think it's Dr. I always say his name wrong, who wrote the Salt Fix, Dina Angelo, who wrote, we got the wrong white substance, right? Salt has so many important functions in the human body. It is crucial. It was traded, it's been traded for eons. It's for gold, even. It was that valuable. So the human body requires electrolytes, and, sodium, of course, being one of the essential electrolytes. And when we remove salt from the body, we can actually, that's interesting. It can actually have kind of a fake elevated blood sugar due to just kind of what goes on in your kidneys. But the take home message is that ideally we don't need to reduce salt. There's not even good studies on that. When the Surgeon General, I think it was 1979, said that, they even said, like, the data's not really good. Um, so, and salt makes food very palatable. We add salt, we use salt meats, you salt, things that whatever you're eating. So it's interesting that there's really no good study that salt is detrimental to the human body when eaten correctly. When I say eaten correctly, we want to use a good bioavailable sea salt. We don't want to be eating processed and packaged foods that have a lot of added salts. So yes, salt, I'm a fan of. Sugar, I am not.
Yeah, so I think there's a list of things that we maybe should at least consider. That cholesterol, which of course is virtually every cell in the body, hormones, is so important that to rid ourselves of cholesterol, we would not survive. And again, red meat is a nutrient dense approach that can give the wide range of amino acids and other. Really, there are things that are called essential. There are no essential carbohydrates, correct?
Yes, there are no, I always say they're essential fatty acids, right? There, if you don't consume certain amounts of fats, you will die. They're essential amino acids. You don't consume them, you will die. There is no essential carb acid. And I'm very concerned about this movement, the last decade plus, to reduce meat consumption. They say it's good for the planet, it's good for the human body. That is not true. I mean, humans once again evolved eating meat. If meat was inflammatory, the human race would not exist. And like you alluded to, it's not just protein. It's all the cofactors that are in meat. It's the B12, the folate, the iron, the carnitine, the carnosine, all the things that make it work well and make it easily absorbed in the human body and brain. These are foods, animal-based foods are what the human body is designed to run efficiently off.
One area of my practice, I focus on treating a lot of people with pain, and I do recall in your story that you did go through a period of being pretty uncomfortable. Maybe you can touch on that and how the nutritional changes help with that component.
Yeah, so my health crisis when I was in 2019, I was trying to qualify for the Olympic trials in the marathon. So at that time, in order to do that, you had to run under 2 hours and 48 minutes, and my fastest time was 2:54. So I was training pretty hard, running quite a few miles, and I was working at the hospital as an acute care dietitian at that time. And it just kind of felt like my body stopped recovering well. It was kind of a slow process. I noticed my joints were hurting, my muscles were hurting, my back, just unusual. And I've been running for a long time. So this was more so than normal training. And, I reached out to a few dietitian coworkers, I saw my family doctor, all my labs were fine. And the dietitians that I talked to said, oh, you need more carbohydrates, more flour, more sugar, more fruits. And for the most part, I was eating whole grains, right? I wasn't eating just ice cream and cookies. I was eating, fruits and oatmeal. But I was eating about 400 grams of carbohydrates a day, which is quite a bit. And I bumped it up to 500. And it felt like my pain and overall anxiety went from bad to astronomical. Like, I started having panic attacks. I was driving to a meeting and I broke out in a cold sweat. And, at the time, I certainly didn't piece it together that it's just my poor body was just having this overreaction to all the sugars and starches I was eating.
Did you feel
And
the pain was in your muscles, your joints, or just pretty
everything,
much widespread? And
joints, muscles, neck. And then, I've shared before that I came home, I had a difficult day at the hospital. We had a patient pass, fell asleep early, and I woke up and it just felt like my body was on fire. Like even like my elbow joints hurt, my legs hurt. And I tried everything, right? I had ibuprofen, I had narcotics, I had alcohol. I tried everything. And, at that moment, I got my car keys and drove to 7-Eleven and got 30 pounds of ice and just sat in an ice bath. It just felt like I said, everything hurt. And that's when my wife came in and said, I think we need to do something different. And I'm, in tears and like, yes, you're right. I'm not going to run anymore. Clearly running is causing all this pain. It's
Well,
running's
you were
fault.
getting kind of old, so maybe you're just beyond your shelf life
You
if you
know,
didn't run.
I was 36 and a lot of competitive marathon runners are in their 20s. So I was like, you know what, this is stupid. What am I doing? I was broken. I was not being effective at work because I was anxious. I wasn't being effective at home because I was in pain. I wasn't obviously running much because I was having cold sweats. And yeah, at that moment, I know certainly not at that exact moment, you don't think of those kind of super sad rock bottom moments that this could be a pivotal turning point in your life. I ended up deciding, like, first I thought I would do like a ketogenic diet because I intuitively knew that consuming that many carbohydrates was not making me feel good, but it just had been pounded into my head from the time I was a young person in treatment for an eating disorder to my education as a dietitian. You have to have carbohydrates. You have to have whole grains. So I decided, I'm gonna reduce them. I'm gonna go very low carbohydrate. And that's when I stumbled upon the carnivore diet, which is a diet of strictly animal products. And of course, I literally laughed. I was like, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Like, no vegetables, no fruit. Like, this is ridiculous. But I still worked at the hospital at that time. So I had access to clinical trials and I started doing some research. And there aren't great resources on the carnivore diet, but there was so many studies on the ketogenic diet that I became kind of angry. I was like, nobody's taught me about this. Nobody told me that, in 8 days, they got a patient off 150 units of insulin on a low carb diet. That's quite a bit. That in 14 days, they could resensitize their cells by 75% to insulin. Like, that's huge. I had patients that were diabetic for 30 years. I watched amputations. I saw rotting teeth. It was, so anyway, that's a long way of saying I decided to follow just meat, fat, salt. I did have coffee too, but for 30 days. And of course, my wife said, she wanted nothing to do with this. She said, this is eating disorder. This will set you back. We thought about it. She cried. And I can't tell you why I was so convinced. I think just because I tried so many different things and this was so different. And of course, that initial transition is rough. I was a very high carbohydrate human. So that first few days, woof, headaches, dizzy, felt awful. I wish I'd known about electrolytes. I encourage anybody, make sure you do a little research and understand how to correctly step into this. I would have consumed a lot more electrolytes. But anyway, but yeah, just a week into eating a low carbohydrate, very, very high protein animal-based diet, my muscle pain was gone. Like,
So you said about a week, and so
about 7 days.
the time till you really, maybe you can describe your timeline of it sounds like you've bounced back and maybe did a little, I
Yeah, so
understand you've done a
7
little
days.
running.
I would say the first 3 days were a nightmare, and that's why I don't want to like glimmer over this because my body was used to burning sugar and carbohydrates, and it was a dramatic switch. All of a sudden you're going to be burning fat and ketones, and during that process you're going to be peeing a lot. You're getting a lot of glucose and water, so you want to make sure you have a lot of sodium, potassium, magnesium, or you can get severe headaches like I did. So just some people do fine. Some people have a rough go initially. I certainly those first few days. And that's when most people will quit too. Like, oh, this is awful. I'm so grateful. I wanted to stick this out. Because like I said, by about day 7, I noticed like, man, my muscles don't hurt. But I also thought like, well, I'm not running anymore. I'm just working. So that must be why. And then I noticed like a few days later, like, gosh, I'm just feeling a lot more calm. Like, I'm not hungry all the time. And I'll never forget, I was in a meeting and my dietetic coworker next to me was kind of like getting antsy, shaky a little bit. And she's like, I got to go get a snack. Do you want a snack? And I remember being like, Chrissy, we're going to have lunch at like noon. And she goes, Michelle, it's almost 2. And that would have never happened. I was one of those people that had to eat every few hours. I would get hangry. I would get dizzy and shaky, but my blood sugar was stabilizing. So I finally like felt calm. I felt like I was present. Like I wasn't constantly like looking at my watch. Is it time to eat? And as someone with a history of an eating disorder, did I eat too much? Did I not eat enough? What am I eating next? Like, it was really nice. Like I just felt at peace. And then 3 weeks into eating this way, I remember I came home and my wife had actually beat me home, which she normally works later than I do. And she was sitting on the couch. And when I walked in, she said, "Hey, can you come talk to me for a second?" And, if you're married or in a relationship, that's usually not the best sign. Like, who died or God, what did I do? And I was like, "Yeah, okay, what's going on?" And she said, "Look, I got to tell you, I don't know if I like how you're eating, but this is the best your anxiety has been in the 11 years that I've known you." And we were both just like, well, we kind of sat there, and she was like, we got to figure this out. She's a scientist. And so we both worked in medical institutions. So it's like, okay, we are going to listen to every podcast. We are going to print out every study we can find. We're going to highlight, we're going to, and so, yeah. And then I guess it was probably about another several weeks later that, it was a weekend and I was home more because I wasn't running. And Corinne's my wife. She likes to read, and I was just kind of like, annoying her, I guess. And she just kind of made a comment like, "My God, would you go for a run?" And I'd kind of given up the dream of running or being competitive, and so I got like kind of nervous. I was like, I don't eat carbs. I don't eat any carbs. And then I thought, like, you know what? Let's put my ego aside for a minute. Like, why don't I just go jog? Like, that's good. It's good to move. Let's do this. And so I put my running shoes on and I said, "Hey, I'll be back in 20 minutes." And I just felt so good. I ran for an hour. And that's when the wheels in my head really started to turn, like, could I use this new way of eating to be competitive again? So and that's when I started to dream, like, well, instead of running marathon, how about I do ultra runs? Ultra marathon is anything longer than 26.2 miles. So yeah, and it's been a great journey. I ended up, I started my journey in October of 2019. And it was my goal and my plan to race in May. I picked out May 2020, but as we all know,
The
around
world got
February,
weird.
March 2020,
Sure.
the whole world shut down. So my race got canceled. I scheduled another race. That got canceled. And then I finally was able to race November 7th, 2020. And I ran my first ultra marathon, which was a 6-hour race. And I covered a little over 44 miles in 6 hours. I won the race. It was
Wow.
wild, it was
Awesome.
a crazy experience. And, and I'm so grateful. And, things have changed and evolved. And we're skipping ahead, I ended up writing the book and doing some other things, but it's been a really, really cool journey.
Yeah, let's focus. I read your book and I had to email you because I really, from the deep dive into your story and then how the various topics you touched on, how I feel like you looked at things all, you turned things to different angles and you had research and gave really interesting perspectives on so many things. Yeah, tell us about the book.
Yeah, so the book is my story. My wife hates the first chapter. It was a little rough go as a young person having an eating disorder. I always say it has a happy ending. And this what it was like kind of going through that, becoming a dietitian. And then I wanted to speak on topics that I felt like one I had seen quite a bit during my time in the clinical setting, and that we had research on, so I talk about type 2 diabetes, mental disorders, including like major depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia. Dr. Chris Palmer is really leading the way on that. I lean on him a lot
Yeah,
for that research.
I just finished his book Brain Energy, which is phenomenal, and
Oh, he's so great. You should have him on your
yeah,
podcast.
yeah,
He's awesome.
I want to interview him too. But
Yeah,
yeah, I mean,
yeah.
one of my whys also of actually for myself um, pursuing the carnivore diet, low carb diet approach was partly to show people, even family members, that it can be done, that you can thrive, but but the mental health aspect. And I know you've touched on your own situation and the testimonials. One of the great things about your book, and I listened to it on audio, which I think is a great way. You do a great delivery, and then there are testimonials from various people you've come in contact with, and some of which have life altering in a wonderful way their mental health situation. Maybe touch on your insight as far as mental health and how nutrition can play a role.
Yeah, mental health is, and I worked in two different psychiatric facilities, and how we feed our psychiatric patients is, in my opinion, criminal. Like, and you're talking about often a patient population too that may not have capacity to even advocate for themselves or say, I want to eat this. They're fed the standard American diet, which is often super high in sugar. The average amount of sugar that is fed to a psychiatric patient is 42 teaspoons a day. And I want to say that's the equivalent of about 4.5 12-ounce sodas. So, but when you're talking about mental health, like most people have kind of thought like, oh, it's just eat healthier, fruits and vegetables. But what, Dr. Palmer and Dr. E, what we're finding is that people with mental health disorders, and it would be my hypothesis that potentially even people with eating disorders just may not metabolize glucose in the brain very well. And we recognize this. I like to use the comparison of epilepsy. Like, we recognize that like babies have epilepsy. It's not that they did anything wrong. It's not that the babies had a bad diet. They just don't utilize carbohydrates well in the brain. So if you're feeding a baby formula or something with carbohydrates, they will have a seizure. So what do? We feed these babies a very high fat ketogenic diet. We feed them, so they're going to be using fat and ketones, and they stop seizing. The brain is now functioning correctly. So what Dr. Palmer, his research is doing, what if we feed people with major mental disorders the ketogenic diet, a higher fat, high protein diet, and we're seeing astounding results. All of a sudden, people with visual or auditory hallucinations are no longer having that issue. People with lifelong anxiety and depression are doing better. I mean, simply stabilizing your blood sugar by eating more meat and fat and lower carbs can improve anxiety and depression for just that alone. But, truly being able to shift your metabolism in the brain can be a game changer. And, people that I saw in the psychiatric care, some people have been struggling with major mental health disorders for decades, suicide attempts, self-injury, unable to function in society, all kinds of medications. And the idea that we can potentially, just by shifting how they eat, could provide a quality of life for people is something that I feel like at least should be presented as an option. Is it going to be the be all fix all for every human? No, absolutely not. Nobody's saying that. But should it be an option? Should it be something, and maybe where we start before going to all this medication, correct? So the amount of people that I have talked to that have just their mental health has shifted once they dropped the sugar and carbs and started focusing on animal fats and proteins is really, it really is humbling. So that's something that I'm hugely a huge advocate for. And my own personal health, I've shared before that as recently as 2017, I was suicidal. I was dealing with some severe depression. I have multiple scars on my wrists from self-injury throughout my life. And I felt like for a lot of my life, I was standing on the sidelines. I couldn't be present. And, when I was 12, I was told like, this is how it's going to be. So I kind of accepted that as reality. But once I was able to eat in a way that really allowed my brain to function correctly, my neurotransmitters are, balanced, I'm getting plenty of vitamins and minerals and things that your brain needs to function. And I'm not eating all this processed food and all these carbohydrates that might potentially suppress my brain from functioning correctly. Now I'm able to, be calm. And it's not like it's perfect. Life isn't perfect. You're still going to have stress and other things. But the difference, most people who are dealing with any type of psychiatric issue, like we just want to function in society. We want to be present. And it's been amazing. And so that's one thing that I'm a huge advocate for. And it's my ultimate hope that we can get a low carbohydrate option added to the nutrition guidelines. That's kind of my long-term goal.
I was just about to ask you, one of the things that I thought was really enlightening in your book was your discussion of those guidelines. Where did those guidelines come from?
Oh my
Maybe tell us
gosh.
a little about that.
That could be a whole nother podcast in itself. But briefly, the nutrition guidelines, it really started with religion. They started with Ellen White, who claimed she had these visions from God that told her that we shouldn't eat meat, we shouldn't eat flesh food. It was bad for the body. It was going to cause tumors. It also was going to cause lustful thoughts. And, her and her husband started the Seventh-day Adventist Church. They started a major university where they did what they called medical evangelicalism. I'm going to say evangelicalism. And they trained some of the first doctors and dietitians. The actual person who, Lena Francis Cooper, that started the Academy of Nutrition, went through that education that you should, only eat plant-based, that plant-based was the way to go. And, and, people brought up concerns like, hey, what about B12? What about some of these other things? But this was back, in the earlier 1900s, that they had research, I'm doing quotes, that came out of the university that said things like, oh, it's fine, don't worry about it. Even though, it's not fine. We know you can't get B12 and, certain other vitamins are only found in animal products. And so, yeah, it's got a crazy history. I mean, you can go back through, it goes through World War II and then, into Vietnam. Trying to think how I can wrap this up. Kind of one of the bigger issues was we started to become worried about fats. I mean, this is where, in the 70s, we're like, oh, fat is causing heart disease. The Sugar Foundation actually paid a lot of money to have these quote unquote studies come out. And you didn't have to disclose where you're getting your funding from back then, that, it's not sugar, it's fat that's causing heart disease. And so at the same time, we also had, Nixon wanted to get reelected, food prices were high. So he hired this guy, Earl Butz, can't make that up. I love that last name, to find a solution. Like, we've got to drop food prices. And so they subsidized corn. And so they, farmers were overnight were making a ton of money. And so they're like, we'll just add corn, we'll add corn to everything. So corn, started appearing in more cereals and biscuits and all this stuff. But we just had a surplus of corn. Like, oh my gosh, farmers are growing all this corn. What are we going to do with it? So Earl actually flew over to Japan because he heard about this new technology they were doing in Japan, where they could turn corn into high fructose corn syrup. And that changed our food landscape forever. He brought that back to the US. And now it was a food manufacturer's dream because high fructose corn syrup was super cheap. It was about a third the cost of sugar. And not only did it make foods taste good, it was a preservative. They could, and so all of a sudden, everything in our food landscape had all this high fructose corn syrup. And remember, this is the same time that we're trying to reduce fat. So amazing. Now we'll just get rid of the fat. We'll add a bunch of high fructose corn syrup. It'll have a great shelf life. And, American people didn't know. It's like, my gosh, all this meat I've been buying, this bread, this dressing, all of a sudden had all this added sugar. And then you had all this messaging like, oh, we've got to keep, fat low. I didn't even touch on Ansel Keys, but, there's another gentleman that came out with this study and he just conveniently left off the countries that didn't meet his hypothesis. But he also said that, oh my gosh, it's saturated fat. Saturated fat's the problem.
It was something, his
major
seven-country
study in the Time magazine. Yeah. You have all this, all this sugar available. You have a country that's afraid of fat. And man, if you look at how obesity increased exponentially since the release of the nutrition guidelines, because we were now consuming so much more carbohydrates and sugar, and you're getting more blood sugar rushes, and you're getting, you have a population now that's, went from eating these nutrient dense, primal filling, blood sugar stabilizing foods to this more processed, high sugar, high blood sugar spiking foods. And I mean, since the release of the nutrition guidelines, I shouldn't say every, I don't know that, but most major chronic conditions have increased exponentially. I mean, type 2 diabetes, mental health disorders, heart disease, cancers. So it's wild. It's not based in science. Like, you would think like, oh yeah, wow, these food guidelines are really scientific based. And since then, since the 80s and 90s, they are completely corporate driven. The Academy of Nutrition, which is the governing board of all dietitians, so who funds my education and all dietitian education, is sponsored by Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Frito-Lay. Like, what a mess.
All the money.
Follow the money. Yeah.
Okay. Well, it's been so great to talk to you. I feel like there's many other things we could touch on. If people want to see more information about you, where might they look to follow your some of your guidance?
Yeah, so I'm most active on Instagram at Run Eat Meat Repeat. Also, you can, if you want to send me an email, you can go through my website, thedietitiansdilemma.net. Also do videos on YouTube through The Dietitian's Dilemma and on Twitter at Michelle Hurn RD.
I was
Oh, and the book's on Amazon. I guess I
yeah,
should
I
say
was
that. If
curious
you
what
want to get
your
the book, it's on
yes,
Amazon.
yes, definitely, and I love the audio. I got the Kindle book because I wanted to be able to look at some of the details that you went through. I was curious what you're doing now. I mean, are you still actively as a dietitian? I mean, it sounds like you've created a lot with the thought leading that you're doing. What currently is your day
It's
job at this point?
funny. People ask me if I miss working at the hospital, and the only thing I do is the paycheck, right? Like it's hard. It's hard. I often say, I wish that doing the right thing made more money. I think that's why a lot of people have to stay in a corrupt, awful system. So I do a lot of things right now. I do one-on-one consults. I do a few kind of side hustle, side jobs. I currently work part-time, seeing patients at a chiropractic clinic. Oh, and then, obviously I advocate with the book. But yeah, I'm still trying to figure out exactly what I want to do when I grow up. But as long as I can spread the message and do the best I can to move the cause forward, that's really what I'm focusing on.
Well, you're doing a fine job, and I think your book is a great place for people to start to get perspectives on so many important things. And as the testimonials in the book indicate, that there are some changes that can be made, and really, again, my motivation for having this this YouTube channel is to show people that they can be better without pills. Realistically, in my medical education, I learned about the diseases and then learned what pills to feed to them. And I do feel at times it's, find a number, is it their cholesterol, blood sugar, high blood pressure, and give a pill for that, instead of recommending lifestyle changes, and just, and as you said, I think you made it clear that there's not a one size fits all answer. And, and it does seem like lower carbs is important. Eh, do you still, I mean, I think in seeing some recent discussion, you still will add some, you find some role for carbs in your, so you're not like a
Oh
carb
yeah. Oh yeah.
Nazi?
I'm a 50-mile racer. So yeah, so I found for like using carbohydrates strategically is, what I would recommend. Because it's not like there's a gold medal for being zero carb. The goal is to be metabolically flexible for every person. You want to be able to burn both sugar and fat. And unfortunately, only 7% of our population is metabolically healthy. So if you're metabolically unhealthy, meaning you have high blood sugar, you're obese, you have high blood pressure, it likely makes sense for you to reduce your carbohydrates pretty significantly for a set period of time, until you're able to tolerate carbs. But I find most people, metabolically healthy, can tolerate small amounts of carbs, defining small amounts somewhere between, 0 and 50 grams. But yeah, I eat about 100 grams of carbohydrates a day, from fruits or rice, some whole food things. Usually post run or like later in the or the night before, like a run. So
Great. Well, it's been such a pleasure meeting you and talking to you. I'd love to talk to you again. I
yeah,
wish
I'd be happy to come back. You just tell me
yeah,
when.
yeah, I wish you the best. Of course, personally and health wise, and all. I think you're spreading an important message, and I really appreciate your coming on to talk to me today.